कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन कर्मण्येवाधिकारस्ते मा फलेषु कदाचन आज मनाए सब मिल शुभ दिन आज मनाए सब मिल शुभ दिन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन इस प्रांगण में सब मिल गाए इस प्रांगण में सब मिल गाए विद्या भवन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन समरे पम पनि धनि सनि पम प नि धनि सा नि धनि सा नि धनि सा घन गाए घन बरखा गाए घन गाए घन निधनि सा निधनि सा निधनि सा निधनि सा घन गाए घन समरे पम प निधनि सा नि पम प घन गाए घन बरखा गाए निधनि सा निधनि सा निधनि सा नि पम प नि पम प नि पम प नि पम प गमरे घन गाए घन बरखा गाए मपनि नि पनि नि पम पनि धनि सा नि पम प गमरे सा नि रे सा नि धनि सा रे सा नि सा घन गाए घन बरखा गाए विद्या का सागर हम बन जाए ये धरा है सबसे पावन ये धरा है सबसे पावन सबसे पावन सबसे पावन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन विद्या भवन नि नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 नि नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 नि नि सा 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 रे रे सा सा नि नि सा 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 रे रे सा सा नि सा रे म रे सा नि सा रे म प म रे सा नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 नि सा 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 रे रे सा सा नि सा रे सा रे सा रे सा रे मा सा रे मा रे म रे म प रे म रे म प रे सा रे नि सा रे नि सा रे नि सा रे नि प नि प म रे सा नि रे सा 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 नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 नि सा 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 रे रे सा सा नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 म रे प म प नि ध नि सा नि प म प नि ध नि सा नि ध नि सा नि ध नि सा नि सा रे म रे सा नि सा रे म प म रे सा नि सा 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 रे रे सा 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 नि सा 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 रे रे सा सा नि सा रे सा रे सा रे मा सा रे मा रे म प रे म प रे.
Following this very beautiful rag by our students, may I, on the occasion of Vidya Bhavan's 90th year anniversary, welcome all of you, especially Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Justice Govind Mathur. There are many chapters to Vidya Bhavan's history. Each period is defined by distinct social, psychological, and historical factors. We were ahead of our times in some periods, and in others we failed to adapt to changing times. Starting in 1931, as a small school in the princely state of Udaipur, Vidya Bhavan broke new ground by fostering democratic and egalitarian agendas. It sought to overcome class, caste, religious, and gender prejudices. It drew its inspiration from the freedom struggle for India's independence and saw the role of education as creating civic-minded individuals. Post-independence, though Vidya Bhavan was considered amongst the best schools in the country, it decided not to become an English medium school. It wanted all sections of society to feel at home in Vidya Bhavan. Middle-class families and upwardly mobile sections of society slowly moved their wards away from Vidya Bhavan. This not only changed the diversity profile of students, it also made it difficult for Vidya Bhavan to become financially self-reliant. Support from government in the form of grant and aid was forthcoming and helped Vidya Bhavan survive and grow to its present size. Government aid came at a price. Vidya Bhavan lost some of its autonomy and it became more conventional in its approach to education. Many in the staff joined Vidya Bhavan because it was paying government salaries and promised job security. The culture of Vidya Bhavan became resistant to change and new ideas. It took many years of struggle by the old boys to renew its founding ethos. In 2011, the grant and aid system came to an end. Government absorbed 1/3 of its staff and withdrew its financial aid. Vidya Bhavan survived the shock of losing staff and finances. In these last 10 years, Vidya Bhavan has used its freedom to improve its infrastructure and facilities, and most significantly, democratize its culture. In 2017, after much debate, it decided to become a bilingual institution and continue its commitment to making good education accessible to all sections of society. The challenge to bring back middle-class families into Vidya Bhavan's fold remains. Vidya Bhavan today stands at a crossroad. Which way should it turn is a question that preoccupied its founder, Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta. When he looked back on 45 years of its journey, he wrote, I quote, should it be content to settle down as an ordinary school and sink into insignificance? Or alternatively, would it want to retain and regain its old position of distinctiveness in the present social scene and educational climate, to continue as a forward-looking force, making education an instrument of social change for building up a new social order? The presence of Dr. Mehta and Justice Govind Mathur on this occasion is a spur to speak truth, not just to power, but to ourselves. As an institution with a rich history, it has underperformed at times. But now, more and more colleagues in Vidya Bhavan, many of whom are from ordinary backgrounds, feel they can redeem Vidya Bhavan's tryst with destiny, be an institution that creatively engages with the challenges before the world of climate change and ecological crisis, growing inequalities and social conflicts, and the anxieties and insecurities created by the present economic and social system. On behalf of my colleagues, the governing structures, the alumni associations, and students, may I welcome Pratapji and Govindji. Their courage and brilliance in the service of truth and justice is an inspiration to the whole country, and to us certainly as we begin a new chapter in the life of Vidya Bhavan. Thank you for listening to my opening remarks. May I now request you to see a short film on Vidya Bhavan.
Vidya Bhavan was conceived while waiting for a train in Europe in 1926. Sitting in the waiting room, Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta entered in his diary the plan of a progressive school, following Baden-Powell's methods for developing children's character, self-reliance, knowledge, initiative, physical fitness, and social outlook. This school finally took shape in 1931 in Udaipur. Along with Dr. Mehta, some of the other pioneers who helped make this idea a reality were Dr. Kalu Lal Shrimali, Shri Kesari Lal Bodia, Shri Fateh Lal Wadia, and Shri Sadiq Ali. They were all young and inspired by Gandhiji's call for nation building alongside fighting for independence. The school itself was nothing short of a revolution for its times. It was co-educational. It was for all castes and religions. It blended nature with classroom learning. And it instilled in children the ideas of cooperation above competition. Dr. K.L. Shrimali, who later on became India's education minister, was Vidya Bhavan's first headmaster, and the school attracted teachers and students from all over the country. In the 90 years since then, the school has produced many illustrious alumni, civil servants, judges, vice-chancellors, and many who have lived quiet lives of value to their communities. From the early batches to now, Vidya Bhavan's alumni spread through the world continue to hold deep attachment and love for the institution. Today, Vidya Bhavan has over 4,000 students and a staff of 550 people across 10 institutions, which includes schools, teacher training colleges, a polytechnic, rural institute, and resource centers on education, environment, and agriculture. Most of these institutions are housed in heritage buildings spread over a 600-acre campus in Udaipur and a 400-acre indigenous forest that preserves biodiversity. The campus facilitates an open ambience for reflection and discussions. Its forests, cafeterias, playgrounds, hostels, and classrooms are sites for character building and academic excellence. In a world teetering on the edge of global warming, growing inequalities, while also bursting with new possibilities and new imaginations, Vidya Bhavan believes we must prepare ourselves and future generations to create more respectful relations among humans and with nature. While we are on a mission to prepare young men and women for meaningful lives and careers in the 21st century, our roots continue to lie in Gandhian thoughts around the idea of making India a great civilization.
Thank you very much for looking at this film. It was made by a young filmmaker, and I hope it captures some of our thoughts going forward. I would like now to introduce Justice Govind Mathur, who provides over the function today, and also Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, our keynote speaker. Justice Mathur retired as Chief Justice of Allahabad High Court in April 2021. He will go down in the annals of judicial history as one of the great defenders of civil liberties. He has steadfastly upheld personal liberty, even of those held under the National Security Act. This at a time when the judiciary is expected to defer to the writ of the state. He was born in Udaipur in 1959 to an illustrious family. After graduating in law from the University of Jodhpur, Justice Mathur practiced widely in various branches of law. He represented many public sector institutions, including the University of Rajasthan and the National Council for Teacher Education. His approach to law and life can be summarized from a speech he made on the occasion of Ambedkar Jayanti. Communalism, casteism, regionalism, gender bias, and closed-minded view of socio-political issues are the antithesis to our constitutional ideals, and we must fight against those fearlessly, fairly, and without any hesitation. As an alumnus of Vidya Bhavan and a trustee, we take great pride in his being regarded as a beacon of fundamental rights for all citizens. Pratap Bhanu Mehta needs no introduction. He is India's leading public intellectual. After a distinguished career as an academic in America, including teaching at Harvard University, he decided to return to India. He wanted to contribute his talents to the cause of higher education in the country and public life in general. On his return to India, he joined Jawaharlal Nehru University in the Department of Philosophy. He then went on to take charge of the Center for Policy Research. Under his leadership, CPR became the leading think tank of the country. He was then wooed to become Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University, one of India's best liberal arts universities. Pratap has another side to him. He is the quintessential gadfly. His writings and newspaper columns are marked by exceptional courage, never failing to critique the abuse of power. He has been honored by many prizes. He has authored many books and serves on the editorial board of prestigious academic journals. As a leading scholar and institution builder, he has served on many international and government bodies, including the National Knowledge Commission. Perhaps more impressive is his giving up prestigious positions on matters of principle. We in Vidya Bhavan are truly honored to have Pratap give the keynote address on our 90th Foundation Day. May I request Pratap ji to give the keynote address. After his talk, there will be a short question and answer session. Thank you, Pratap.
Justice Mathur, Ajay, distinguished guests, it's truly an honor for me to be able to speak to you on this absolutely astonishing occasion, which is we are celebrating a great institution. Ajay was characteristically modest about Vidya Bhavan and characteristically self-reflective about Vidya Bhavan's ups and downs. But the fact of the matter is that the survival of institutions like this and the leadership position that they have taken in the context in which they function has never been more important than it is now. And at least I haven't been in touch with Vidya Bhavan over the last few years. It's been a while since I visited Udaipur, so nostalgically I'm using an Udaipur background as my Zoom picture. But Vidya Bhavan has all the values and the foundations for really becoming the kind of institution that I think India needs at this juncture. I'm a little bit intimidated to speak on this occasion because after some discussion with Ajay and Suraj, they suggested that I talk a little bit about the challenges of liberal education in the current context. And I feel a little intimidated talking about that, in part because, let me summarize my anxiety this way. I think I know what liberal means. I'm not sure anybody wants to now apply the label to themselves anymore. There's either a kind of overt hostility to the label or a sense of embarrassment about it. And I'm increasingly less sure what education means. And so what I'll do over the next 25, 30 minutes is share some of my perplexities with you. I'm also a little bit intimidated, and this is, I think, the first note I want to begin with, to be speaking in the presence of Justice Govind Chandra Mathur. As Ajay said, he has been an absolutely exemplary judge of the kind that we did not think was possible to see in contemporary India. I mean, his last 12 to 15 rulings as Chief Justice really kind of set new benchmarks, the kind you remember, let's say, Sir Maurice Guire ruling in the context of Defense of India Acts, or possibly even Justice Khanna. And I will actually talk about the legal profession a little bit later on. But if you wanted an exemplar of what it means to think as a liberal, what it means to think as a constitutional citizen, I think you do no better than look at Justice Govind Chandra Mathur's recent judgments. It's also personally always tricky for me to talk to anybody in Udaipur, particularly associated with Vidya Mandir and Seva Sadan. I mean, the Mehta family is like family, and so there is a bit of nepotism here in some ways. Late Mohan Singh Mehta, of course, has been the example for any institutional builder, and I think the brief periods that I've been Vice Chancellor, I have to say, the thought did cross one's mind on many occasions. What would Vice Chancellors like him do? Jagat Mehta was personally extraordinarily kind, and the hours he spent in faculty meetings at Center for Policy Research was a liberal education in its own right. Uday is almost like a guru and a mitra, and Ajay and Vikram's public service and kindness has always been exemplary. So it's hard for me to take an objective view, as it were, of this. Even if I'm speaking from this distance, it is with almost an emotional insider. So if I hope you'll forgive me for that. So the topic that, as I said, Ajay invited me to reflect on was the topic of liberal education in this context. And I'll meander between sort of school education and higher education. My own interests and field is higher education. I know very little about school education. Now, at one level, and what I'll try and do is kind of place the idea of liberal education in a sort of maybe larger historical and comparative context. What are the kind of contrary demands that we place on ideas of education in contemporary moments, and how are those contrary demands in some senses, pulling us apart? What are the tensions that constitute the contemporary education project? So before I come to that, just one more preliminary remark, which is, at one level, when one looks at education in contemporary India, as always, there is actually reason for immense hope. As much as one can get despondent sometimes by the sheer challenges, and particularly in the pandemic year, when you look at literally the tens of millions of kids whose education has been set back in ways that we cannot even begin to fathom. When you look at the ways in which the pandemic has once again exposed the profound educational inequalities, when you look at learning level scores that Pratham and PISA testing and all the various yardsticks consistently throughout, it's sometimes easy to get despondent about Indian education. And certainly I think that despondency is worth confronting seriously, because it should be a spur to action. But on the other hand, I have to say that this is a interesting and in some sense also deeply encouraging time for education. I have actually no nostalgia for the education systems of the last 60 to 70 years. We all know, this is an obvious fact, that democratic India's single biggest failing across regimes, whether it's Nehruvian, post-Nehruvian, was its absolutely dismal performance on education in comparative terms. India achieved 100% enrollment, something as low as that, I mean, as low a yardstick as 100% enrollment only in the late 1990s, almost 70 years after education. And on very many parameters, which I'll discuss in a little bit, our commitment to education as a society, the state's commitment to education remains extraordinarily weak and fragile. Indian spending as a proportion of GDP on education, just to take the crudest of yardsticks, right? Nothing speaks louder than money, by the way. Whatever, no matter else what one might say on these matters, is still amongst the lowest amongst the developing world. Why the crisis doesn't look as catastrophic is in part because India has done always what India has done, which is there's a lot of private spending, there's work around government institutions, and the demand for education has truly exploded. Just to give you a sense of it and the challenges, just the structural context in which we are talking about liberal education. If you take a year before the pandemic, 2019, India was opening 3 new colleges a day. Okay? Think of any other higher education system in the world. If the United States had to open 3 new colleges a day, the system would collapse, right? So gross enrollment ratios are shooting up. In higher education, the most extraordinary, and to my mind, the most revolutionary news is that the gender balance in education, as we know, India is now producing almost the same number, if not slightly higher, of STEM women graduates, right? Which is actually higher than in any developing country, STEM women graduates. There is a lot of extraordinary innovation. The variety of institutional practices that you see across institutions in India, in universities, the different kinds of schools, different pedagogical philosophies that people are experimenting with. You look at all of that and you say, look, there is a kind of energy to this sector, right? There is an aspiration, there's an energy, there is certainly a degree of private commitment and aspiration about education that is unprecedented in Indian history, right? And yet, coming back to the despondent story, it's very hard to place all of this, right, in some kind of encouraging statement of collective effort or India's future. And that's really, in a sense, what I want to talk about. Okay? So I was looking up Vidya Bhavan's history for this talk, and one of the things that struck me most in thinking about debates that happened around the creation of Vidya Bhavan, I'm not fully acquainted with them, but the little that I could access, from what I could see of Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta's, I think, vision. Just as a historical aside, I came across this book, many of you may remember. It's a fetch shrift for Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta. I think it was given to him in 1968. And the title of that fetch shrift was truly alarming. It was called Education or Catastrophe, right? As a kind of indication of where Indian education stood in 1968. It's a wonderful collection of all of India's most eminent educationists at the time, right? But what struck me most remarkably, I think, about Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta's fundamental premise, and I think that's the premise that I want to talk about a little bit, whether we can take that premise for granted, we can function with that premise, was the premise that it is education that is the primary pathway to social change. John Dewey once asked this question rhetorically, is social change, does society shape education or does education shape society? Now, any sensible person would, of course, say both. There's got to be a reciprocal relationship between them, right? Which is the broader social context class structures, social structures, family norms and values shape the kind of education that is going to be available in a society at any given moment. But the reverse is also true, that if you think of the institutions of education, universities, schools, they in turn will be able to shape those social norms quite profoundly and decisively. And I think one of the interesting, premises behind Vidya Bhavan's kind of history was, it was very decisively on the side of education as the source of social change, right? If we only can get these education institutions right, get kids at the right age, teach them the right values, right? Subject them to the correct curriculum, the correct sort of physical regimen, build up their character, these students will be, in a sense, sources of social change, right? If you were a Marxist, you would actually say, this is the classic expression of passive revolution, right? By passive revolution, we mean this is a reflection of the fact that there is a fairly confident, cohesive ruling class that thinks it can control the process of education, right? Yeah. That can, in some senses, bring about social change amelioratively, right? Bit by bit, institution by institution, generation by generation, right? And education in this case performs the dual function of both allowing ameliorative social change to happen, while at the same time, right, preventing the privilege of that class that controls this form of education from ever being seriously questioned. Okay? And I must confess that if you look at the history of Indian education, I think a little bit of this cynicism about this premise is warranted. I don't mean in the case of individuals or individual institutions like Vidya Bhavan, who were in some senses swimming against the tide, or individual great educationists, Malcolm Adishashaya, V.V. John, Mohan Singh Mehta, D.S. Kothari, all of them who were completely and utterly and sincerely committed to education, right? But this incredible confidence that somehow through education you can manage this process of change, right? In a way that will not really seriously upset the existing hierarchies, particularly of class. I think in retrospect, that assumption comes out, quite strikingly. And I think we have to confront that assumption for the following reason. And that when I think of liberal education, the prospect of liberal education, right? I think of 5 key promises of the idea of liberal education. Okay? The first promise is a liberal education promises a new form of social relationship, right? A form of relationship between citizens that is best expressed in our constitution, the constitution that Justice Mathur has so valiantly defended, right? Which is that as citizens, we are free and equal, right? That's supposed to be the first objective of a liberal education, right? Now, one of the interesting things I think about Indian education, in the history of Indian education, is that it has never taken this aspiration of education seriously. Yes, formally, there has been, immense amounts of social change. Certain forms of caste discrimination are no longer hegemonic or acceptable, at least in education institutions, although really not as much as we would like to believe. I think they still exist. Formally, we say distinctions of gender and class should not matter. But the institutional frameworks that we have created for education, right, do not adequately reflect this commitment. Why do I say that? As I said, one simple test is society even willing to spend the money to actually realize this commitment? Why did not India adopt a much more robust public school, common schooling system of the kind literally every democracy in the world has adopted, right? You can't think of a single major Western democracy, right, where the linchpin of civic education, of creating citizens, of creating a modicum of social equality was the public school system, right? Okay. India is actually an outlier in some senses in the degree of privatization that we allowed in our school system. Okay. Now, it's a big debate. We can talk about public versus private schools. I don't want to get into that. But one of the things that the form of expenditure that our school system did was that it allowed the kind of segregation, right, that marked our society to continue and to be reproduced within our school systems. Okay? Indian schools are not melting pots of social hierarchy. Okay? The more private schools you have, in some senses, private schools have many advantages. But one of the things private schools typically also tend to do is reproduce the segregated character of society. Perhaps not overtly by caste. No private school will discriminate on the basis of caste these days, at least hopefully not, but certainly in class terms. Okay? For the longest time, I think the Indian elites, who were made by colonialism, right, did their utmost to prevent the massification of education. There's no other explanation for why India was so slow in thinking about creating a common school system where all these invidious distinctions could be in some senses erased. Okay? So the first challenge, I think, for liberal education in India is to just acknowledge this fact, this profound and disturbing fact of inequality in education and how educational institutions are the sites at which inequality is reproduced, reflected, or refracted, not the sites at which equality is mitigated in some deep sense. Okay? So that's, in some senses, I think, proposition one. And I think as Vidya Mandir goes ahead, I mean, I think Ajay himself referred to this, right? This tension that the minute the school opened up to a vernacular medium, the minute the school opened up to, right, a different class base, the elite, in some senses, that had invested in that school began to secede, right? And there are various levels of secession, right? First, the secession was to elite public institutions. Then it was from elite public institutions to elite private institutions. Then from elite private institutions to foreign institutions, right? So sociologically, we have not created institutions at the higher level or at school level that seriously confront the question of mitigating this equality. So I think that's the first, I think, proposition I'd just like to, for Vidya Bhavan to think about what role it can perform. Can it create a model, right, where both the elite is invested and those who aspire to social mobility, those who have been hitherto marginalized in every sense of the term, right, have the same stakes in a common institution? There are very, very few institutions in India that you can describe in those terms. Right? And I have to say, I mean, all of us have been guilty of being sort of part of those kinds of institutions. There's been no easy solution to that problem. Okay? So I think that's in a sense proposition number one on the equality side. The second proposition, which is more pedagogical, and I think this thought was suggested to me in email correspondence with Suraj, who's been involved with Vidya Mandir, but also it's a thought that is very much in the air, that comes out of thinking of a fundamental tension in the liberal project of education. Right? And this tension can be described in the pedagogic aims as the tension between, you might say, meritocracy and equality. Okay? I don't think we have a pedagogical model, again, in any of our institutions, school or higher education, that has been able to navigate this tension effectively. What do I mean by this tension? India is, of course, by no means a meritocracy by any stretch of the imagination. When I use the term meritocracy, I'm not referring to a sociological description of Indian higher education, but I'm referring to a certain kind of self-image, a certain kind of justificatory logic that goes into the making of our education institutions. Right? Now, at one level, meritocracy, I mean, you know, Michael Sandel, Daniel Markovits, this is the flavor of the month these days, the criticism of meritocracy. But this criticism of meritocracy has been around for the last 50 years, and it is worth reiterating. Now, at one level, meritocracy is an attractive idea. It's an attractive idea because it seems to involve three principles that, independently speaking, seem attractive in their own right, right? One, meritocracy was historically the opposite of aristocracy, right? Which is, in an aristocracy, I'm using the term aristocracy broadly, the allocation of educational opportunities, of public offices, was dependent on certain identity characteristics that you might have. The family you were born in, the ethnic group you were born in, the caste you were born in, sometimes even the religious community you were born in, right? In part, the attraction of meritocracy was as a critique of aristocracy, right? Which is presumably what matters in the allocation of these positions is something we call your talent, your effort. What does not matter is your inherited identities. More important, where you are going and how you can get there is much more important than where you came from, right? I mean, that's the historical attraction of the idea of meritocracy. I don't care whether you're a Brahmin or a Dalit or a Jew or a Catholic, it's completely irrelevant, or a man or a woman, right? So in some senses, the meritocracy principle was the opposite of an aristocracy principle. It embodied its own aspiration to equality, right? The second attractiveness of the meritocracy principle was a certain principle of fairness, seeming principle of fairness, right? People are getting what they deserve, right? Okay? It's a principle, it provides a principle of allocation that prima facie seems fair. And one of the, I think, interesting things about our society is instinctively how that has become the common sense notion of fairness, right? You know, we all say people should get things on their merit. Whatever merit might consist in, you know, we can talk about those philosophical conceptions, but as a default common sense, people associate the allocation of merit with fairness. By the way, just as an aside, just as a little aside, reservations or affirmative action is not incompatible with a meritocracy. In fact, ideally designed, a system of affirmative action or reservation is a way of deepening meritocracy, because the underlying premise of affirmative action and reservation is not, right, that we are in some senses deviating from the norm of merit. The underlying premise is there is a group of people who have merit, but we have been unable to identify it because they have not been given the opportunities, right? If you just gave them the opportunity, you will be able to draw the meritorious from a much larger social pool than you otherwise might have. And historically, actually, that's the logic of affirmative action. It's not. I mean, this is where I think even the Indian Supreme Court goes seriously wrong of kind of thinking of merit and affirmative action as in some senses opposed concepts sometimes, at least in some of its articulation, right? So meritocracy seems to involve a principle of fairness, and it also seems to involve a principle of efficiency, right? In a world driven by market forces, right? When you say the best person is getting the job, you presumably also mean this person will be the most productive at this job, right? So equality, entitlement, and efficiency. It's a pretty attractive system, right? It's the premise by which we pretty much allocate everything in our education system. Admission places, we allocate on this basis. Technically, jobs, we allocate on this basis, right? Okay. Now, and we also think that there is a dialectical relationship between this principle of meritocracy and equality, because you can be a genuine meritocracy only if you have given equality of opportunity in the first place, right? I know I have risen on my merit, so the argument goes, if you and I have both competed at least on the same terms, right? So there's incredible, I think, moral attraction to the idea of meritocracy, right? It was in its own way a revolutionary idea, a kind of revolt against aristocracy. There are three downsides to meritocracy, which is what people have begun to focus more on lately, right? The three downsides to meritocracy are, first, that meritocracy requires by its very nature a principle of commensuration, right? When I'm selecting somebody, I am comparing one person with another, right? Why did you get the job? Because you were better. Why did you get admission? Because you were better, right? So it requires both a principle of commensuration, and that principle of commensuration in turn itself creates a new form of inequality, right? Okay. The second thing that, of course, a meritocracy requires is competition, right? The assumption is that relative to what people want to do, there will always be a scarcity, relative scarcity, right? A meritocratic system is a competitive system. You want to be better than someone else, right? Okay. So in that sense, our relationship to our fellow citizens is an inherently competitive relationship, right? Even to our friends, as that famous line from 3 Idiots goes, right? जब friend fail होता है तो बहुत दुख होता है, जब दोस्त first आता है तो और भी ज़्यादा दुख होता है, right? Yeah. But it's inherent in that. And the efficiency principle, right? That one of the reasons at least firms and education institutions should select the best is because they in turn themselves will be judged on their productivity, right? Okay. Now, if you take these three principles, commensuration, competition, and let's call it consumption, this productivity principle, what kinds of relationships do they create amongst students and between citizens, right? We are adversaries. We start off with the premise of equality, right? We have the same starting point. That's the premise of meritocracy, conceptually. And yet the outcome is going to institutionalize an even more insidious form of inequality. Because now the inequality says, I got this because I was better than you. I worked harder than you. I deserve this more than you. The nice thing about an aristocratic system is that nobody pretended to deserve anything, right? Okay. It's in this sense that a meritocratic system is psychologically comes with a much greater sense of entitlement, right? It was possible to shame an aristocracy. And in fact, I think the kind of commitment that you saw in the Indian aristocracy towards education in the 1930s, 40s, in part came from this sense because they knew they were not entitled to what they had, right? But of course, now if I come top, right, I'm in some senses entitled to what I have, right? And I think this fundamental tension, and I think it has sociological consequences. I mean, not just in the West, but I think I felt that for years and years in India, is that for Indian society, the big political challenge is going to be that if you organize a system of education and of jobs around winners and losers, right? What do you do psychologically to those who do not come out on top in this competitive system of commensuration, right? In some senses, not doing well is an even bigger curse in our social circumstances than it probably was 50, 60 years ago. I don't mean materially, but in terms of self, in terms of kind of psychological, right? So you have this fundamental inner tension in what we are promising. On the one hand, we are prizing individuality and excellence and making that the basis of social esteem, right? On the other hand, we are actually saying that this is a society in which everybody should have at least some equal basis for their own self-esteem. Right? And I do not know of an institution, an education system that has been able to reconcile this profound tension. This profound tension is reflected in our pedagogic practices. I can speak of universities where at one level, right, this generation of students is remarkably more talented than we ever were. It's remarkably more gifted, creative, even socially committed, I think, than we were. But the one thing you notice in a lot of students in this generation is that I think the psychological pressure on them is also far greater. Now, part of that psychological pressure is, of course, that they're going through multiple transitions together, right? In Indian society, you have transitions over gender, sexual roles, identity, political transitions, economic uncertainty. But at base, this haunting question, what if I don't make it in this system that now thinks of itself as deeply legitimate, right? In the old system, if I didn't make it, it could be materially brutal, but at least it wasn't my fault, right? Okay. So I think one of the challenges, I think, and this is where this goes back to the proposition I started about, with the society shape education or education shape society. That if in this new meritocratic dispensation, self-describedly meritocratic dispensation, right, the stakes of losing are going to be so high, right? What is actually going to happen to most of our citizens, right? And to my mind, you cannot resolve this tension fundamentally unless the background conditions of society are a little bit more egalitarian, right? If I don't have to worry that the difference between coming first and fifth is the difference between night and day in my social prospects, right? I might be able to live a very different kind of life than, if I live in a context where the stakes between even coming first and second between 97.005% and 97.0043% is the difference between life and death almost. Right? So this tension between how do you reconcile meritocracy and individuality with equality and mutual respect, to my mind, cannot be resolved at the level of the school itself. It's not just a matter of saying if the school instills the right values. There's a lot of pastoralism in education these days, sort of almost a kind of therapeutic conception of teach students how to cope with failure, right? Tell students it's not terrible if they come second. The brutal truth is we are lying to them. If as educators we tell them that there aren't these social consequences attached to that failure, right? And I think the whole premise of, I think the kind of, the education first model was that somehow educators can resolve this tension. We can't, right? I can't with a straight face tell my students that if you don't come out top of your class, your prospects are not going to be seriously damaged. Professionally speaking, I'll be lying to them because that is the nature of the social structure that they're actually going to exit into. So I think here's the kind of interesting question. I think that, the one I started with, which is to go back to Dewey's formulation. How much can education swim against this tide of deep social inequality? Right? Okay. And are we as educators lying in some senses or mischaracterizing things if we think that it can? Okay. I want to sort of make two more points of this. We talked a lot about kind of this inner tension of equality in the promise of liberal education. There's a third thing I think we want to talk about, and this was inspired by Justice Mathur's presence here. It's something that I've been thinking about a little bit, which is the role of the professions in education. So when we think of liberal education, when people think of liberal education, as I said, people can think of it as a form of social relationship, which is what we've been talking about. Equality, reciprocity, self-esteem, meritocracy. How does liberal education reconcile all of these different ideas? It is often also thought of these days as a broad form of education, right? In India, particularly, liberal education is supposed to be the antithesis of some kind of engineering education or professional education, right? That's the kind of mania for new liberal universities. It's a broader education. A liberally educated person will be educated in a number of disciplines. To my mind, again, I think there's some element of truth to that, but that's not what's most, I think, interesting about liberal education. To me, the most interesting thing about liberal education was the fact that it was supposed to be the space between state and capital, right? So the state and the language of power, right, demands a certain kind of obedience and allegiance, right? So you can educate people for the purposes of serving whatever those in positions of power want you to do, right? The logic of politics. Or education can serve the logic of the economy. There's a frankly instrumental purpose to education, both for your personal advancement and from a social point of view, what society values by way of what it wants to educate its students in. Liberal institutions were supposed to be this non-instrumental space. This is a space where I can think without, on the one hand, worrying about considerations of power, right? I do not have to worry about, will I be censored? Does it please the current political dispensation? Does it please the reigning political hegemonic ideology. I'm freed from a certain kind of logic of power, but I also freed from a logic of instrumentalism, right? I don't have to worry about the question, is the knowledge I'm producing or the question I'm thinking about useful to anybody? It might turn out to be useful. Sometimes even the most obscure theorem in mathematics turns out to be worth $1 billion. But I'm not thinking about them in the context of their use and their usefulness, right? And the true hallmark of a liberal education was the creation of spaces where you could protect education both from the depredations of the state and the instrumentalism of the economy, right? Now, the first challenge in thinking about liberal education is a space of this kind. Where do you create those spaces? Are our universities those kinds of spaces? Can they navigate this narrow corridor between the imperatives of power on the one hand and the imperatives of commercialism on the other? Okay. How rare are those institutions? How few they are? And frankly, what kind of elite support does it take to maintain those kinds of institutions? I think the biggest crisis of liberal education, to my mind, is that people no longer believe that universities can navigate this narrow corridor between power and instrumentalism, right? Okay. So what kind, and that's, I think, that I see the challenge I think Vidya Bhavan has been facing in its history, right? Which is, how do you run a school that is either not dependent on the state, but nor is it dependent on fees and revenue, right? In a commercial sense, on the other hand. But how is it tied to the professions, right? And particularly legal profession. So to my mind, I think the opposition that we make in India between liberal education and professional education and science education and engineering education is a deeply mistaken opposition, right? It's a deeply mistaken opposition because a liberal education is profoundly about a mode of inquiry. It's not about a subject of study. That if I've studied 5 subjects, that makes me more liberally educated than if I studied 3. To be very honest, if you asked me what are the ingredients of a liberal education, I would actually give you a boring answer, which is the ingredients of a liberal education are mathematics, some form of logic and reasoning, right? The ability to read and articulate. If you have these are the enablers that can allow you to access pretty much any form of education. It can allow you to access any subject matter, right? On the other hand, if you don't have these in full measure, it doesn't matter whether you're doing history or sociology or philosophy or law, right? Okay. So one of the things I think for a good school system is how strong is it in providing the enablers that allow you to access a variety of discipline. Because if you have those enablers, you'll be able to access content. It always puzzles me why we think that if you're a good historian, you can't read a good sociology book, right? This whole idea that education is defined by the domain of study, the object of study, right? Good philosophical reasoning and good legal reasoning have a lot in common, right? Yeah. But one of the interesting things about the profession, why I want to think of professions as part of the liberal education spectrum, and particularly the legal profession, is that in the 19th century, most educators would have said that actually a professional education is the linchpin of a liberal society. Why? Because a professional education says the basis of my standing in society is knowledge, right? my path to advancement, if I'm advancing through professional education, is not that I've inherited capital, right? Capital doesn't, right, particularly care about, what form of knowledge you might have. It's not the fact that I had access to state. It is the fact that I come to society with a form of knowledge. And the authority of that knowledge comes from the fact that it is actually autonomous of both market and state, right? A good officer of the law is one who says, I am an officer of the court. I'm a legal professional, right? I'm neither governed by the instrumental knowledge of the market. I'm for hire. I'm entirely instrumental in my orientation to my professional practice. Although in practice, a lot of professionals are like that, right? But nor am I in some senses beholden to state power, right? And in the 19th century, I think most people thought that in a complex society like ours, if you ask the question, where will new forms of morality be produced that are compatible with the complexity of our society, most people would have actually said it's actually the professions. If the lawyers think of themselves as officers of the court, you have in that the creation of a new autonomous morality, right? That is neither based on capital nor is it based on the state. It is based on regard for the sanctity, autonomy of something we call law in all its substantive majesty, right? You can even take a profession like chartered accountants, right? CAs, auditors. This is an incredibly important profession for social morality, right? I mean, this is the fundamental source of accountability. And if you look at the crisis of modern societies, take the 2009 financial crisis, for example. People often talk about, the greed of capitalists, the infirmities of banking system, deregulation. But the most important failure in producing that crisis was the failure of the professions, right? If the lawyers are doing their job, if the chartered accountants are doing their job, right? You can produce incredible amounts of accountability in society. And one of the things I think I'd urge us to think about when we are thinking about this idea of a liberal education is, as I said, is this space. How do we produce students whose identity is constituted by the norms of their profession, where they actually begin to say that if I'm an officer of the court, this means something, right? It means something for how I think. It means something for what I'll be held responsible for. And it is a source of morality for me. It's not an empty phrase. And so to my mind, rather than think of liberal education as this pushback against professional education, as this pushback against, sort of economic education, as this pushback against, one has to actually see what's the common thread that you want in a liberal education. Right? It is that my knowledge places a fiduciary responsibility on me as a citizen. And if I discharge those responsibilities, that itself is a form of social good. Right? Okay. The last and final thing, sorry, I've gone on too long, very quickly, and the biggest challenge for liberal education is, so one of the expectations of liberal education is that it creates a language of common citizenship. Often, one of the things education has been tasked with is creating a common national identity. Right? Now, one of the reasons liberal education has been very hard to get off the ground in India is because the minute you ask the question of national identity in education, education becomes a divisive subject, not a uniting subject. You are in Udaipur. Right now, there's a controversy going on about what to write in the plaques at Haldi Ghati, right? Did Rana Pratap actually retreat at some point, even if he came back to win later or not, right? In part, a national identity is almost always created, as Ambedkar said, by a story we tell each other about our own past. And often nations are united by the common points of antipathy they can create, right? Since history and orientation to our own past has been one of the central pillars of a liberal education, how does this community of citizens place itself in the flow of time, relate to its own past, and imagine its own future? Right? The most spectacular challenge, I think, for liberal education in India has been that the minute we pose this question, it by its very nature becomes a divisive question. There simply is no narrative of the past that we can all agree upon, right? That gives India its particular distinctive identity or unites its citizens around particular antipathies. Is Akbar your hero or is Rana Pratap your hero? Now, a good liberal answer might be, why can't both be your heroes? Right? But that's a bit of a cop-out answer if you think about it hard enough. Right? And one of, I think, the serious crises for institutions like Vidya Bhavan, for all our humanities curriculums, has been that on the one hand, liberal education promises this fidelity to the truth, right? We will confront the past with warts and all, with a critical imagination. And yet that critical imagination, if you take it seriously, cannot of its own accord produce the historical narrative that is required for us to think of ourselves as a nation subsisting in time. In other words, the project of a liberal education is by its nature deeply antithetical with the project of nationalism. These two projects cannot be reconciled. And I actually think it's the credit to this governments that repress liberal education, that they're at least honest enough to admit that contradiction. I think liberals have got their head in the sand about this contradiction. Again, not just in India, you can see it in the United States, right? The deep divisions that any discussion of the past generates, right? 1619 versus 1776, right? When the Prime Minister of India says, the liberation of Ayodhya is as important as 15th August, as a statement of historical fact, right? What kind of historical narrative can actually unite us? And so one of the challenges I think institutions like Vidya Mandir, as all will be grappling with, is how do you reconcile the demands that are placed on liberal education to produce this common language of nationalism and citizenship with the fundamentally subversive and individualistic character of liberal education? Okay? It's not an accident that, purveyors of liberal education like Tagore and so forth actually could do it only in small enclaves, almost seceding from the rest of society. Okay? And the challenge, I think, for liberal institutions is going to be, in times of the kind of nationalistic fervor that we have, right? will society simply say, why do we need liberal education at all? Even if our nationalist narratives are purveying lies to us, we find those lies much more energizing, right, than the bald truths that, a liberal education will provide. So in short, for Vidya Mandir, I think the three sort of big challenge, which is, how do you think of inequality in the space of education and the tension inherent to our ideals of excellence? How do we protect the institutional space from both the imperatives of the market and the state? And how do we protect this institutional space from the coercive demands of nationalism? I actually don't see any educational institutions in India that are being able to navigate these three fundamental challenges of liberal education. And I hope that as Vidya Bhavan proceeds, I think for its next 100 years, it'll be a new beacon, I think, allowing us to navigate our way through these challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pratap. It's an extraordinarily brilliant and honest reflection on place of liberal education in our country. There have been many questions, and I don't think perhaps there's now time to raise them and ask you to answer them. But I have to say that your own courage in confronting these honestly is perhaps the way forward, even though the odds are against perhaps reconciling, as you said, nationalism with an attempt to sort of speak the truth. But this may be a good time to ask Justice Govind Mathur Sahab to share his reflections, because like you, he also, whatever his analytical insights, still believes that the truth has a certain power of its own. So, Justice Govind Mathur, please, will you give your remarks?
Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, keynote speaker and chief guest of the program. Shri Ajay Mehta, President Vidya Bhavan Society. Mrs. Pushpa Sharma, President Vidya Bhavan Old Boys Association. My friends, students of Vidya Bhavan, past and present. Thank you very much, Dr. Bhanu Mehta. As a matter of fact, today morning, in early morning when I opened Indian Express, I just moved to page number 5 of the Jaipur edition. And I found your article as usual in Indian Express. And that was a treat for me to have a complete analysis about this Pegasus issue. And then with regard to this Aspire and the stand of the government. Fortunate I am to be with you on this platform in my evening hours. I am profoundly delighted and deeply honored to preside the 90th Foundation Day program of my mother institution, Vidya Bhavan. Vidya Bhavan has a national reputation in learning-based education. And what I understood about learning-based education from Vidya Bhavan is that it is not only classroom teaching. It is also not a clinical diagnosis for our social ills or for our simple day-to-day development. It is a complete environment. It is a complete atmosphere to develop a vision to see and analyze each and every event and incident of all the issues of the globe. Education amidst such environment makes us able to adapt and carry our own philosophy. Vidya Bhavan has extended such environment for learning. And that is the reason that the students of Vidya Bhavan are not only successful in their life, but also have attained eminence. I feel proud to be a part of Vidya Bhavan family. While tendering my gratitude to my institution, my every word is dedicated to Bhai Sahab, late Dr. Mohan Singh Mehta. Bhai Sahab not only conceived the idea of Vidya Bhavan, but also shaped it. He was a great statesman, thinker, and educationist. We all students of Vidya Bhavan, past and present, are indebted to Bhai Sahab and also to the great teachers, as referred in the film just we saw, Dadabhai K. Bordia, Marshall Sahib, and all other teachers, great teachers who worked with Vidya Bhavan. As I referred that in morning it was street for me while reading the article of Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta. In evening, this thought-provoking lecture by Dr. Mehta about all the problems, issues, and future of the education in our society. Main emphasis about this meritocracy and individuals, the liberal education. But you see what we are facing. What Dr. Mehta mentioned that he is no nostalgia. Individually, all of us are having no nostalgia so far as we individuals are concerned to have our education, to have education for our children, but collectively, especially in this era, nostalgia is there in each and every aspect. You see, we are again, instead of going ahead, we are talking about the past, which as a matter of fact has lost its utility nowadays. And education also. What we have seen in this spent 2 years, this 1.5 year of pandemic. An important aspect of the liberal education is reason and logic. But in this 1.5 year, you will find that while combating this pandemic, the reason and logic was nowhere. Our doctors, our academicians, they were talking in a different fashion. They were talking in a fashion that is to move ahead. But most of the citizens collectively, not individually, they were talking about, and they were, as a matter of fact, adopting a kind of nostalgia. When we are talking about the knowledge, when we are asking about that, this is the only the education that is the way for social reforms or to the social development, all to break all the ills of our society. But there is a calculated efforts to maintain the same. True it is that in last several years, the caste system has been broken. But what is the issue with regard to class differences? Before pandemic, Dr. Mehta has just pointed out that this number of opening of the colleges was too high. It was much more vis-a-vis United States. But whether we are really concerned for education, education to my knowledge, education, medical and even judiciary. These are not the priorities of the government. Knowledge, information, everything is there. But what about the wisdom? Can knowledge be applied without wisdom? And I have seen in courts, in day-to-day life, when we are talking about all those things which are concerning us to negative nostalgia. We are all having all respect and regards for our traditions. But when we are talking about our education system, when we are talking about objective conditions of the society, there is a calculated efforts for re-establishing or restoring certain those things which are not at all relevant in the present scenario. I think with all the challenges, with all the aspects pointed out by Dr. Bhanu Mehta just now, Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta just now, which are required to be met by Vidya Bhavan, a very, very important responsibility lies to have a complete system that will go ahead, a progressive education system, which may bring out our students, our entire all citizens from a status quo mentality. What I have noticed from the efforts of on the state level, it is only literacy. It is only the literacy that want to be expanded. But what about education? Article 21A that was introduced. What Article 21A is, number of schools have been opened, number of educational institutions at the state expenditure, the exchequer, these are there, but we are not getting anything more than the fundamental basic literacy. Dr. Mehta mentioned that yes, that so far as the gender bias in education is concerned, that is a ice-breaking way. The girls are coming in education in great number. I have seen in judicial services where the number of girls is much more higher vis-a-vis the male counterparts. But merely the number of girl students, is that sufficient, or the values which we are required to have for females, for women, whether our education system is adequate to change those values? I think much emphasis is given by Dr. Pratap on liberal education. As a matter of fact, I will need a complete session, one more session to understand the liberal education. What he has explained, it is a great for me. But I wish that our liberal education must fight our those values which are creating division in society. I see my society when I was young. I was of the view that the day is not far where factionalism in our society would not be there, and the education would be the most important means for that, to remove all kind of factionalism, casteism, gender bias, and even class difference. But in last several years, as a matter of fact, all those ills earlier diagnosed, the ills diagnosed by Gandhian values, those have been nurtured, more effectively nourished, and those are creating hurdles in development of India as a nation, Indian citizens as a society, and we as a happy people on this globe. I wish that education be a weapon, a very sharp weapon for combating all these ills. Our higher education I have noticed that most of the persons who are having science background, they are talking in the most non-scientific, unscientific manner. I understand that it is not the science as a subject, but it is your scientific approach, scientific bent of mind that would be an appropriate weapon or an appropriate way of thinking for removing all factionalism or all ills from the society. But as a matter of fact, in last 20 to 30 years, this scientific approach, the scientific mode of thinking, this is missing even in the sciences students. In humanities, whatever it may be, whatever subjects there may be, but to develop, to promote scientific mode of thinking. I'm not saying that it will be the Marxist fashion or any other mode, but at least a progressive thought, at least to understand and at least to recognize the ills which are prevailing in the society, those to be removed by our education system. Our future of our education system, what I feel is that we are still required to go with Gandhian thought of education system. It is not only the literacy, it is not only the education for employment. Employment is an offshoot. Ultimately, it is the knowledge and broadening of the wisdom. That is the main aim of the that is the target of our education. Much time I have taken as because we had Dr. Pratap Bhanu Mehta with us. He has enlightened us, ignited our minds. We will certainly think about that, and we will certainly try our level best to have his ideas implemented. I would certainly like to understand his ideas in much more better way by sitting someday with him. But essentially, a seed has been sown by Dr. Mehta. Thank you very much. I would not like to take much time as a questionnaire time for the introduction that has only been curtailed, and that reflects that the much time is not available. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Mathur. It's wonderful what you're indicating as the way forward. May I now just end this event by requesting Pushpa Ji, who's the president of the Old Boys Association of Vidya Bhavan, to give a vote of thanks. Pushpa Ji.
किसी भी संस्था के 90 वर्ष सफलतापूर्वक पूर्ण होना अपने आप में एक बड़ी उपलब्धि है। गर्व है हम सबको विद्या भवन पर और इसके संस्थापक श्रद्धेय डॉक्टर मोहन सिंह मेहता पर, जिन्हें हम प्यार और सम्मान से भाई साहब कहते हैं। आइए हम सब मिलकर याद करें सन 1931 की पहली प्रार्थना सभा, जब प्रार्थना सभा के बाद भाई साहब ने भीगे हुए नेत्रों से स्कूल के पहले हेडमास्टर कालूलाल जी श्रीमाली को गले लगा लिया। साथ ही ले चलना चाहती हूँ मैं सभी को सज्जनगढ़ की हरी भरी वादियों में, जहाँ हवा के मस्त झोंकों और बारिश की ठंडी फुहारों के साथ हम सब 21 जुलाई के कार्यक्रम को मनाते थे। उन रोमांचक क्षणों की सुखद अनुभूति को हम सब आज भी अनुभव कर पा रहे हैं। आज के समारोह के मुख्य वक्ता प्रोफेसर प्रताप भानु मेहता और समारोह के अध्यक्ष स्कूल के पूर्व विद्यार्थी जस्टिस गोविंद माथुर जी की उपस्थिति ने विद्या भवन की 90वीं वर्षगांठ को चिरस्मरणीय और ऐतिहासिक बना दिया है। हम विद्या भवन परिवार की ओर से प्रोफेसर मेहता और गोविंद जी के प्रति हार्दिक धन्यवाद प्रेषित करते हैं कि आपने अपना अमूल्य समय देकर और अपने प्रभावशाली उद्बोधन से विद्या भवन संस्था की अविरल यात्रा को एक अहम पड़ाव दिया, आज की संध्या को एक यादगार संध्या बना दिया। विद्या भवन सोसाइटी के अध्यक्ष आदरणीय अजय मेहता साहब को मैं कोटिश धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करती हूँ कि आपके संरक्षण में आज का समारोह संपन्न हुआ। शताब्दी समारोह की परिकल्पना की प्रणेता स्नेहिल नीलिमा जी को भी बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद कि आपके निर्देशन में आज स्थापना दिवस से शताब्दी समारोह के कार्यक्रमों का सुंदर आगाज संभव हो सका। विद्या भवन पर दिखाई गई लघु फिल्म के लिए श्री तन्मय भंडारी भी उनके प्रति भी हृदय से धन्यवाद ज्ञापित करती हूँ। इसी तरह विद्या भवन पब्लिक स्कूल के विद्यार्थियों ने सुंदर संस्था गीत प्रस्तुत किया, वह अभिव्यक्ति भी सराहनीय है। आज के वेबिनार आयोजन में तकनीकी व्यवस्था हेतु IIM उदयपुर के प्रति भी हार्दिक आभार व्यक्त करती हूँ। इस आयोजन से जुड़ने वाले श्रोताओं को भी बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। साथ ही उन सभी साथियों को साधुवाद जिन्होंने प्रत्यक्ष अप्रत्यक्ष रूप से अपना सहयोग देकर आज के स्थापना दिवस के कार्यक्रम को सफल बनाया। हम सब जानते हैं कि आज के समय में दूरियां बढ़ गई हैं, किंतु डिजिटलाइजेशन ने दूरियों को कम किया है और आज इतनी अच्छी संख्या में हम सब लोग जुड़ पाए। यही कामना करती हूँ कि हम इसी तरह संस्था से सदैव जुड़े रहेंगे। एक बार पुनः प्रोफेसर प्रताप भानु मेहता और गोविंद जी का तहे दिल से शुक्रिया अदा करती हूँ और मातृ संस्था के लिए कहना चाहूंगी, सदा रहे अक्षुण यह संस्था, सदा रहे अक्षुण यह संस्था, बने भविष्य के चिर निर्माता, बने भविष्य के चिर निर्माता। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
Thank you very much. Pratap, you have to teach, so and thank you, Govindji. Thank you, Pushpaji. Thank you.
Thank you.